Somewhere in the darkness above northern Pakistan, two silent helicopters crossed the border without permission. Inside them were men who had trained for years for a mission that might last only minutes. Their target was a quiet compound in the garrison town of Abbottabad. High walls. Barbed wire. No internet connection. No phone lines. And behind those walls, if the intelligence was correct, was the most hunted man on earth. Osama bin Laden. But nothing about the situation made sense. The compound sat only a short distance from Pakistan's military academy. The helicopters flying toward it were invisible to radar only under perfect conditions. And the entire mission depended on intelligence that had taken nearly a decade to assemble. Then something went wrong. One of the helicopters lost control and crashed inside the compound. And in that moment, the most secret raid in modern military history was seconds away from collapsing. The question was no longer whether the target was inside. The question was whether the men on the ground would make it out alive. And the story of how they got there reveals one of the most extraordinary intelligence hunts in modern warfare. In the early hours of May 2011, Abbottabad was quiet. The Pakistani garrison town lay in darkness beneath the foothills of the Himalayas, its streets still, its neighborhood silent. At first glance, it was an unlikely place for the world's most wanted terrorists to hide. Abbottabad was not a remote tribal village or a lawless frontier settlement. It was a military town. Pakistan's equivalent of West Point sat less than a mile away. Retired officers lived in comfortable homes nearby. Cadets marched across parade grounds each morning under the disciplined routines of a professional army. For years, the United States had searched the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Pakistan for Osama bin Laden. Intelligence agencies monitored caves, tribal compounds, and border crossings stretching across thousands of kilometers. Yet the man responsible for the September 11 attacks appeared to have vanished. But that was only part of the story. The hunt for bin Laden had begun almost immediately after the collapse of al-Qaeda's sanctuary in Afghanistan in late 2001. American Special Operations Forces, CIA paramilitary teams, and allied Afghan fighters had pushed deep into the mountains of Tora Bora, convinced they were closing in on their target. The intelligence suggested bin Laden was there. The terrain suggested he could escape. And in the chaos of those final battles, he did. For the next several years, the search became one of the most complex intelligence operations ever conducted. Satellites scanned mountains. Signals intelligence monitored phone calls across multiple countries. Informants were recruited from villages, militant networks, and prison cells. Still, there was nothing. No phone calls. No internet activity. No confirmed sightings. The leader of al-Qaeda had disappeared into silence. And this silence was not accidental. Osama bin Laden understood surveillance better than most intelligence analysts realized. Years of evading intelligence services had taught him a crucial lesson: modern intelligence relied heavily on electronic signals. So he eliminated them. He used no phone. No email. No electronic communication of any kind. Messages traveled only through trusted human couriers, men who carried handwritten notes across cities and borders, sometimes taking days or weeks to deliver a single message. This decision created a nearly perfect shield against the most powerful surveillance network in the world. But it also created a weakness. Because if intelligence officers could identify the couriers, they might find the man they served. And this is where the long search slowly began to change. Throughout the mid-2000s, CIA analysts focused increasing attention on one particular figure inside al-Qaeda's network, a trusted courier known by the alias Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. For years, his name appeared in scattered intelligence reports. Captured militants mentioned him during interrogations. Intercepted communications referenced him indirectly. Fragments of information suggested he was deeply trusted by bin Laden himself. But no one knew where he was. And that uncertainty would haunt the investigation for years. But eventually, a pattern began to emerge. The courier had connections in Pakistan. More specifically, he appeared to be operating somewhere in the northern part of the country. At first, the intelligence was frustratingly incomplete. Surveillance teams followed leads that went nowhere. Informants produced rumors that dissolved under scrutiny. Even when analysts believed they had identified the courier's real identity, they still had no clear location. But intelligence work rarely moves in dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, it advances through slow accumulation. Fragments of conversations. A license plate seen in passing. A phone number. Used once and then abandoned. Piece by piece, analysts began reconstructing the courier's movements. And eventually, those movements led them to Abbottabad. In 2010, surveillance teams finally located the courier driving through the town. He lived inside a strange compound on the outskirts of the city. At first glance, the compound looked unusual but not extraordinary. But closer inspection revealed something strange. The property was surrounded by unusually high walls, some reaching nearly 18 feet. Barbed wire lined the upper edges. 2 large security gates controlled access to the inner courtyard. And inside the compound were several buildings arranged in a tight cluster. What immediately puzzled analysts was the scale of the security compared to the apparent occupants. The courier and his family lived there. But the compound was far larger and more fortified than anything required for an ordinary household. Even more curious were the security precautions. The residents burned their trash rather than leaving it for collection. There were no visible phone lines entering the buildings. There was no internet connection. And the people inside almost never left the compound. CIA surveillance teams began watching the property around the clock. From safe houses in the surrounding neighborhood, analysts monitored movement patterns inside the walls. Over time, another detail emerged. Someone else was living there. A tall man occasionally walked in the courtyard during the early morning hours. He never appeared outside the compound. He never traveled in vehicles. And no one ever photographed his face clearly. Inside CIA headquarters, analysts began referring to him simply as the Pacer. The man who walked in circles inside the walls. But that detail created an unsettling question. If the courier was living in the compound, and this mysterious figure never left it, then who exactly was walking inside those walls? And that question would soon draw the attention of the highest levels of the United States government. Because if the intelligence analysts were right, they had just discovered the hiding place of the most hunted man on Earth. By late 2010, the discovery of the Abbottabad compound had created a quiet storm inside the American intelligence community. At first, the evidence seemed promising but far from definitive. CIA analysts had spent years chasing shadows across the mountains of Afghanistan and the tribal regions of Pakistan. Every few months, a new lead would appear, an intercepted call, a suspected safe house, a report from an informant. And almost every time, those leads collapsed under scrutiny. Now they had something different. A compound with unusual security. A trusted courier living inside. And a mysterious man who never left the walls. But that still wasn't proof. Inside the CIA's counterterrorism center, analysts began assembling what they called a pattern of life study, an exhaustive analysis of every visible behavior associated with the compound. Satellites passed overhead repeatedly, capturing images from different angles. Surveillance teams in nearby safe houses observed daily routines. Every movement inside the compound was logged. Every vehicle entering or leaving was recorded. Every delivery, every visitor, every light that turned on after sunset. Over time, a picture began to emerge. The courier, identified as Abu Ahmed al-Qaeda, appeared to manage the outer layer of the compound's life. He traveled into the city for supplies. He spoke to neighbors when necessary. He handled most interactions with the outside world. But the inner portion of the compound was different. The third floor of the main building was surrounded by privacy walls designed to block observation from nearby rooftops. Laundry hung from lines inside the courtyard, children's clothes, women's garments, and occasionally items that appeared to belong to a tall adult male. But no man matching that description ever appeared outside. No one entered the compound to visit him. And no one ever saw him leave. The surveillance teams watching the compound found themselves focusing on small details that might seem meaningless to anyone else. The man walked slowly inside the courtyard. Back and forth. Back and forth. Always alone. Always within the walls. He seemed careful not to expose himself to overhead observation for long periods. One analyst later described the behavior in a classified assessment. The individual demonstrates operational security awareness consistent with a high-value target. But even that observation did not settle the question. Inside CIA headquarters in Langley, debate intensified. Some analysts believed the evidence was compelling. Others believed it was dangerously thin. There were no photographs confirming the man's identity. There were no intercepted communications linking the compound directly to al-Qaeda leadership. There was no DNA. No fingerprint. No definitive proof. And the stakes were enormous. If the United States launched a military raid inside Pakistan and the target was not Osama bin Laden, the consequences would be severe. Pakistan was officially an American ally. Sending Special Operations Forces into its territory without permission risked a diplomatic crisis, and possibly armed confrontation with Pakistani military forces. Inside the White House Situation Room, intelligence briefings became increasingly tense. CIA Director Leon Panetta presented the evidence carefully. The courier had long been associated with bin Laden. The compound was built with unusual security features. The mysterious resident behaved like someone who understood surveillance. But the intelligence community could not assign full certainty. The probability estimates varied. Some analysts believed there was a 60% chance bin Laden was inside. Others argued the probability was closer to 40%. In intelligence terms, that level of uncertainty was enormous. And yet, waiting carried its own risks. If the man inside the compound truly was bin Laden, the window to capture him might close at any moment. He could relocate. The courier network could change. The trail could vanish again. Years of intelligence work could disappear overnight. And this is where the pressure began to build. Military planners were asked to develop options. One proposal involved a massive airstrike using B-2 stealth bombers and heavy precision bombs. The strike would obliterate the compound completely. But it would also destroy any physical evidence confirming the target's identity. Another option involved cooperation with Pakistani authorities. But intelligence officials feared that informing Pakistan in advance might compromise the operation. If word leaked, even accidentally, the target could disappear before American forces arrived. That left one final option. A direct raid. A small team of Special Operations Forces would fly into Abbottabad under cover of darkness, assault the compound, identify the target, and extract before Pakistani forces could respond. It was an extraordinarily dangerous plan. The helicopters would have to penetrate deep into Pakistani airspace without detection. The assault force would operate inside a densely populated city. If the mission failed, or if the helicopters were shot down, the operators would be trapped deep inside a foreign country. And yet, the plan had one crucial advantage. It offered certainty. The men on the ground could confirm the identity of the target with their own eyes. And that possibility changed the entire conversation. But even then, one question remained unanswered. If the mission went forward, Who would carry it out? For years, Osama bin Laden had been the most hunted man on earth. Entire armies had crossed continents trying to find him. Intelligence agencies had spent billions of dollars searching deserts, mountains, and cities across the Middle East and South Asia. Satellites had scanned entire regions of the planet looking for a single human being. And yet he had vanished. Now, suddenly, there was a compound in Abbottabad that might contain him. But the intelligence was incomplete. No photograph confirmed his presence. No intercepted message carried his voice. No piece of evidence proved beyond doubt that the man walking inside those high walls was the architect of the September 11th attacks. Inside CIA headquarters, analysts faced a problem that intelligence officers know well: the difference between suspicion and proof. They had enough clues to believe something extraordinary might be happening inside the compound. But not enough to prove it. And that uncertainty created a mystery that dominated every briefing. Who exactly was living there? The compound itself raised more questions the longer analysts studied it. Satellite imagery showed that it had been constructed around 2004, several years after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan had driven al-Qaeda's leadership underground. The buildings were unusually large for the neighborhood, and the outer walls were far higher than those surrounding nearby houses. More unusual still was the internal layout. Most residential compounds in Abbottabad allowed visibility from the outside street into parts of the courtyard. But this compound had been designed specifically to prevent that. The upper balconies were shielded by tall privacy barriers. Windows were positioned to limit lines of sight from nearby buildings. Even the rooftop area of the main structure had been enclosed with additional walls. Every design decision suggested one thing. Whoever lived there wanted to remain unseen. The residents' behavior reinforced that impression. The courier and his brother handled all outside interactions. They purchased food in town. They paid bills. They dealt with neighbors. The other occupants never appeared in public. Children occasionally played inside the courtyard, but they never attended local schools. Women were rarely visible from surveillance positions. And the tall man, the pacer, remained almost completely hidden. Analysts observed him walking in the courtyard for short periods each day, usually in the early morning or late afternoon. Always alone. Always within the inner section of the compound. Never near the outer gate. Never close enough for a clear photograph. The pattern suggested deliberate caution. Whoever he was, he understood surveillance. But there was something even stranger. Despite the large size of the compound, there was no sign of wealth. No expensive vehicles entered the property. No security guards patrolled the perimeter. No obvious defensive weapons were visible. If the mysterious resident truly was Osama bin Laden, analysts expected a more elaborate security arrangement. Yet the compound functioned almost like a fortress of silence. No phone lines. No internet cables. No electronic signals. In an age when nearly every human activity left a digital trace, this place existed almost entirely outside the modern communications network. And that absence was itself suspicious. Because the man American intelligence was searching for had spent years deliberately avoiding electronic detection. But that still wasn't the most puzzling part. The compound's location raised the greatest question of all. Abbottabad was not an isolated tribal region. It was a military city. Pakistan's premier military academy stood less than a mile away. Retired officers lived throughout the surrounding neighborhoods. Security patrols regularly moved through the area. If the mysterious resident truly was the leader of al-Qaeda, he had chosen to hide in one of the least obvious places imaginable. Right under the nose of Pakistan's military establishment. Inside the CIA, analysts debated what that meant. Some believed it was deliberate strategy. The safest hiding place might be the last place anyone would expect. Others worried about a darker possibility. Could elements inside Pakistan's security services know he was there? No one could answer that question with certainty. And the longer the surveillance continued, the more the mystery deepened. One particularly revealing detail emerged from the trash. Or rather, the lack of it. Most households in Abbottabad placed their garbage outside for municipal collection. The residents of the compound did something different. They burned everything. Every scrap of paper. Every piece of packaging. Every bag of household waste. Nothing left the property. Which meant nothing could be recovered by intelligence collectors. That level of operational security was unusual for an ordinary family. But it made perfect sense for someone who had spent years evading global intelligence agencies. Inside the CIA, analysts began constructing psychological profiles of the unknown resident. He behaved like a man under constant threat. A man who avoided communication. A man who trusted only a tiny circle of intermediaries. A man who rarely exposed himself to observation. In other words, a man who had spent the last decade hiding from the most powerful intelligence services on Earth. But even as the theory grew stronger, proof remained just out of reach. There was one idea, an extraordinary one, that might settle the question. Intelligence officials considered collecting DNA from someone connected to the compound. If they could match it against known samples from bin Laden's family, the mystery might finally be solved. But acquiring that DNA without revealing surveillance operations would be extremely difficult. And time was running out. Because the longer the United States waited, the greater the chance the target might disappear again. And if that happened, the trail could vanish for another decade. Which meant the decision facing American leaders was becoming unavoidable. Either they acted on incomplete intelligence. Or they risked losing the opportunity forever. And this is where the story takes its most dangerous turn. Because once the decision to act began taking shape, the operation would depend on a small group of soldiers who specialized in the most difficult missions on Earth. Men trained for a single purpose. To enter places no one else could reach. And finish the mission before anyone even realized they were there. For nearly a decade, the search for Osama bin Laden had been driven by intelligence. Satellites, informants, intercepted communications, and endless streams of data had slowly narrowed the hunt to a single compound in Abbottabad. But intelligence alone could not finish the mission. At some point, someone would have to go inside. And if that moment came, there was only one unit in the United States military trained specifically for operations of that kind. The Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Known more commonly by its older name, SEAL Team 6. The unit had been created after the failure of the 1980 Iranian hostage rescue attempt, when American military planners realized that conventional forces were not designed for the kind of highly precise hostage rescue and counterterrorism missions the modern world increasingly demanded. SEAL Team 6 was built for a different type of war. Small teams. Extreme precision. Short, violent operations conducted in the most dangerous environments imaginable. The operators selected for the unit were already veterans of the Navy SEALs, one of the most demanding special operations communities in the world. But admission into SEAL Team 6 required another level of scrutiny. Candidates passed through a selection and training process known as Green Team. It was designed not simply to test physical endurance, but decision-making under pressure, tactical awareness, and the ability to operate inside complex environments where mistakes could mean the death of teammates or hostages. Room-clearing drills were repeated thousands of times. Weapons handling became reflexive. Communication between operators developed into something closer to instinct than conversation. The goal was simple. When the moment came to move through a doorway in combat, hesitation could not exist. Every man had to know exactly what the others would do before they did it. By 2011, the operators inside the unit had accumulated years of experience across multiple war zones. Many had fought in Iraq's urban battles. Others had conducted raids in the mountains of Afghanistan. Some had already spent years participating in the relentless campaign against al-Qaeda leadership that followed the September 11 attacks. They had hunted bomb makers, facilitators, and regional commanders across 2 continents. But none of those missions carried the weight of what was now being considered. Inside classified planning rooms in the United States, military and intelligence leaders began developing a concept for a direct assault on the Abbottabad compound. If the decision were made, the raid would require extraordinary precision. The assault force would have to travel deep into Pakistani airspace without detection. The helicopters would fly low across mountainous terrain to avoid radar coverage. Once over Abbottabad, the aircraft would insert the operators directly inside the compound walls. From that moment forward, everything would depend on speed. The assault team would need to clear multiple buildings, identify the target, collect intelligence materials, and leave the area before Pakistani air defenses or military forces could respond. Every minute inside the compound increased the risk. Because if Pakistani fighter aircraft or ground units arrived before the Americans could escape, the situation could escalate into an international crisis. Or worse. The mission planners faced several enormous challenges. First, the helicopters. Conventional transport aircraft would likely be detected by Pakistani radar systems long before reaching Abbottabad. To avoid that risk, the planners selected a modified version of the MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter equipped with classified stealth features designed to reduce radar and acoustic signatures. The aircraft would fly at extremely low altitude, following terrain contours to remain hidden from radar coverage as long as possible. The second challenge was insertion. The compound's high walls prevented helicopters from landing outside the buildings themselves. The aircraft would have to hover above the courtyard while operators fast-roped to the ground. In darkness. Inside a confined space. Surrounded by unknown threats. The margin for error was small. And the third challenge was time. Once the helicopters crossed the Pakistani border, the clock would begin ticking. Pakistani radar operators might notice something unusual. Air defense networks might detect unidentified aircraft. Local military units might scramble to investigate. If the operation lasted too long, the assault force could find itself fighting not only the occupants of the compound but also the military forces of a nuclear-armed nation. Which meant the operators had to finish the mission quickly. Very quickly. But the tactical planning went far beyond basic insertion and extraction. Inside a secure training facility in the United States, a full-scale replica of the Abbottabad compound was constructed using intelligence gathered from satellite imagery and surveillance. Every wall. Every doorway. Every staircase. The assault force rehearsed the raid repeatedly. They practiced moving through the compound in darkness. They rehearsed possible resistance from armed occupants. They rehearsed identification procedures in case the target attempted to hide or disguise himself. Again and again the operators ran the scenario. Until the sequence of movement became automatic. And yet, even with all the preparation, the planners understood one uncomfortable truth. There was still a possibility that the intelligence was wrong. The compound might contain someone else entirely. Or the target might escape during the assault. Or Pakistani forces might intercept the helicopters before they could leave the area. And this is where the story becomes even more tense. Because as the planning continued, the decision moved beyond military strategy and into the realm of political risk. Only one person could authorize a mission of this magnitude. The President of the United States. And the choice he faced was one of the most difficult any leader could confront. Act on intelligence that was still uncertain. Or allow the most wanted man in the world to remain hidden somewhere behind those walls in Abbottabad. The final authorization came quietly. After weeks of intelligence briefings, debates, and operational planning, the president approved the mission in late April 2011. The decision was delivered to the small group of commanders responsible for executing the operation. From that moment forward, the timeline accelerated. Inside a secure hangar in Afghanistan, the helicopters assigned to the mission were prepared for a flight unlike any they had ever attempted. The modified Black Hawks had been designed to reduce radar detection and dampen acoustic signatures, but even with those modifications, the journey into Pakistan would remain extremely dangerous. The aircraft would cross more than 100 kilometers of foreign airspace without permission. If detected, they could be intercepted by Pakistani fighter jets within minutes. And once they reached Abbottabad, the pilots would be forced to maneuver their helicopters inside a confined urban compound surrounded by high walls and buildings. The mission would demand absolute precision. But that was only part of the risk. Inside the helicopters, the assault force from SEAL Team 6 prepared their equipment carefully. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Night vision devices were calibrated. Breaching charges were distributed among the operators responsible for entering each building. Every man knew his position in the assault sequence. Every man knew the layout of the compound from memory. Months of rehearsals had reduced the mission to a series of movements practiced over and over again. But rehearsals could never reproduce the unpredictability of reality. And the operators understood something else. If the mission went wrong, there would be no immediate rescue. They would be deep inside a foreign country, surrounded by unknown threats, with limited time before local military forces responded. Yet there was no hesitation. 4. These men, the mission represented the culmination of years spent fighting the same war. Many of them had deployed repeatedly to Iraq and Afghanistan. They had hunted al-Qaeda leaders across remote villages and mountain ranges. They had watched the network responsible for the September 11 attacks slowly fragment under relentless pressure. But the man who built that network had remained beyond reach. Until now. On the night of May 1, 2011, the helicopters lifted off from their base in Afghanistan shortly after darkness settled across the region. The flight path carried them across rugged terrain toward the Pakistani border. Inside the aircraft, the operators sat silently, listening to the steady vibration of the rotors. No one spoke unnecessarily. Each man focused on the sequence of actions that would begin the moment the helicopters reached Abbottabad. Weapons were held across armored vests. Night vision goggles rested ready above their eyes. The pilots flew at extremely low altitude, hugging the contours of the landscape to remain below radar coverage whenever possible. Mountain ridges and valleys passed beneath the aircraft as they moved deeper into Pakistani airspace. At this stage, the operation remained completely invisible. No alarms. No interceptors. No sign that anyone on the ground was aware of their presence. But that calm would not last forever. As the helicopters approached Abbottabad, the pilots slowed and descended further. City lights appeared below. Residential neighborhoods stretched across the darkness. Somewhere among those streets stood the compound that had occupied American intelligence analysts for months. The pilots aligned their approach carefully. 2 assault helicopters would enter the compound directly. Additional aircraft carrying reserve forces and support teams remained nearby. Everything depended on the insertion. If the helicopters could place the assault teams inside the walls quickly and quietly, the mission might unfold exactly as rehearsed. But as the first helicopter descended toward the courtyard, something unexpected happened. The high walls surrounding the compound created a strange aerodynamic effect. The swirling air from the rotor blades had nowhere to disperse. Hot air trapped inside the courtyard disrupted the helicopter's lift. For a moment, the aircraft became unstable. The pilot fought the controls, trying to stabilize the machine before it struck the wall. But the air currents inside the compound were stronger than anticipated. The helicopter began losing lift rapidly. And within seconds, the pilot realized there was only one option left. He brought the aircraft down hard inside the compound. The helicopter crash-landed in the courtyard. For a brief moment, the entire mission teetered on the edge of disaster. The noise of the crash shattered the silence of the neighborhood. Dust filled the courtyard. Debris scattered across the ground. And inside the compound, the occupants now knew something extraordinary was happening. But the operators of SEAL Team 6 did not hesitate. Before the dust even settled, they were already moving. Because the mission had not failed. It had simply begun in a way no one had expected. And what happened next would become one of the most famous special operations raids in modern military history. The crash inside the compound lasted only seconds. But those seconds could have destroyed the entire operation. The modified Black Hawk lay crippled inside the courtyard, its tail section damaged by the hard landing. Dust and debris filled the air. The noise had shattered the quiet of the surrounding neighborhood, and somewhere beyond the walls, lights were already beginning to switch on in nearby houses. For the operators on the ground, there was no time to think about what had gone wrong. They moved immediately. The assault plan had been built around speed and aggression. Even with the helicopter down, the structure of the operation remained the same: isolate the compound, breach the buildings, clear each level, and locate the target as quickly as possible. One team secured the crash site while the rest of the operators repositioned toward the main structures. Explosive charges were placed on the first gate. The detonation shattered the barrier and the assault force moved through the opening in seconds. Inside the compound, confusion spread rapidly among the occupants. The residents had been asleep when the helicopters arrived. Now armed operators wearing night vision equipment were moving through the buildings with terrifying speed. The first resistance came almost immediately. One of the couriers, Abu Ahmed al-Qaeda, appeared armed near the guest house at the front of the compound. The operators engaged him quickly. The encounter lasted only moments. The assault team continued forward. Every movement followed a pattern refined through years of training. One operator entered a doorway while another covered the interior angles. Each room was cleared systematically. Every staircase was approached with caution. The teams moved upward through the compound floor by floor. What made the raid so effective was not simply the skill of the operators, but the discipline of the process itself. Close-quarters combat inside buildings is among the most dangerous forms of warfare. Visibility is limited. Distances are measured in meters. Every doorway can conceal a threat. But the operators of SEAL Team 6 trained for this environment constantly. Each man knew exactly where his teammates were positioned. Each man understood the angles of fire inside the structure. Each movement through the building was controlled, deliberate, and fast. The assault force divided as planned. One element secured the lower floors of the main building while another team began climbing the narrow staircases toward the upper levels. But this is where the mission reached its most critical moment. The intelligence analysts had believed the mysterious Pacer lived on the top floor. If that assessment was correct, the man they were searching for would be somewhere above them. And the higher the operators moved, the greater the risk became. Because if the target realized what was happening, he might attempt to escape through a hidden route or barricade himself inside a final defensive position. The team continued upward. On the second floor, another armed occupant appeared in the hallway. The operators reacted instantly, neutralizing the threat before it could develop into a firefight. The stairway to the third floor remained. At this point the mission had been underway only a few minutes. Outside the compound, the backup helicopters circled nearby, ready to support the extraction once the assault teams completed their task. But every additional minute increased the chance that Pakistani military units might begin moving toward the area. The operators reached the final staircase. One of the SEALs moved forward carefully, weapon raised, night vision scanning the darkness ahead. At the top of the stairs stood a tall figure. For nearly a decade, this man had existed only in intelligence briefings, intercepted messages, and fragments of information gathered from captured militants. Now he was standing only a few meters away. The operator recognized him immediately. Osama bin Laden. The engagement that followed was brief. The operators fired multiple shots, striking the target and ending the search that had consumed American intelligence agencies for nearly 10 years. But the mission was not finished. Inside the compound were computers, storage drives, documents, and handwritten materials that could reveal the structure of al-Qaeda's remaining networks. Collection teams immediately began gathering everything of potential intelligence value. Hard drives were removed. Documents were packed into bags. Digital storage devices were secured for analysis. At the same time, explosive specialists prepared the wrecked helicopter for destruction. The stealth technology embedded in the aircraft could not be allowed to fall into foreign hands. Explosive charges were placed on the damaged Black Hawk. Moments later, the aircraft was destroyed in a controlled detonation that echoed across the compound. Within minutes, the assault teams regrouped with the collected intelligence materials and the body of the target. The helicopters descended once more into the courtyard. Operators boarded quickly. The aircraft lifted into the night sky and turned toward the Afghan border. By the time Pakistani military forces began reacting to reports of explosions in Abbottabad, the helicopters were already disappearing into the darkness. And the most hunted man in the world was no longer alive. The raid in Abbottabad lasted less than 40 minutes. Yet the success of that mission was the result of years of intelligence work and decades of evolution in modern special operations warfare. Operation Neptune's Spear demonstrated something that military planners had long suspected but rarely seen executed so clearly: intelligence, precision, and small unit capability could achieve strategic results that massive military campaigns often struggled to produce. For nearly 10 years after the September 11 attacks, the United States had deployed hundreds of thousands of soldiers across Afghanistan and Iraq. Entire divisions had fought prolonged battles across cities, deserts, and mountain ranges. But the operation that finally ended the hunt for Osama bin Laden involved only a handful of helicopters and a small assault force. The key difference was not firepower. It was information. The raid succeeded because intelligence agencies had spent years patiently assembling fragments of data that eventually pointed toward the Abbottabad compound. The identification of the courier network, the pattern of life surveillance, and the careful analysis of behavior inside the compound created the conditions that made the raid possible. Without that intelligence foundation, the operation could never have taken place. But intelligence alone was not enough. The mission also demonstrated the importance of speed in modern counterterrorism operations. Once the helicopters crossed into Pakistani airspace, the assault force operated on a strict timeline. Every phase of the mission, from insertion to building clearance to extraction, had been rehearsed repeatedly to minimize delays. This speed created a crucial advantage. The occupants of the compound had no time to organize meaningful resistance. Local security forces had no time to react before the helicopters were already leaving. In special operations doctrine, this principle is known as violence of action, overwhelming speed and precision applied in a very short window of time. Operation Neptune's Spear was a textbook example of that concept. The raid also revealed the growing importance of highly specialized military units in modern warfare. Traditional armies are designed for sustained combat across large territories. Special operations forces are designed for something very different: short, targeted missions that focus on specific objectives. Over the previous 2 decades, the United States had invested heavily in developing units capable of operating in that environment. By the time the Abbottabad mission was launched, those units had accumulated thousands of combat operations across multiple theaters. The operators who entered the compound that night brought with them years of battlefield experience, advanced training in close-quarters combat, and an ability to operate with minimal support in extremely dangerous conditions. Another important lesson involved planning and preparation. The construction of a full-scale replica of the compound allowed the assault force to rehearse every detail of the mission. Potential obstacles were identified before the helicopters ever left the ground. Even when the unexpected helicopter crash occurred, the operators were able to adapt quickly because they understood the structure of the compound and the sequence of the assault. Preparation had reduced uncertainty. And that preparation allowed the mission to continue even when the plan began to unravel. But perhaps the most significant lesson from Operation Neptune Spear was the integration of intelligence and military power. The raid was not simply a military operation. It was the final stage of a global intelligence campaign. Analysts, surveillance teams, interrogators, technical specialists, and informants had all contributed pieces of information that ultimately guided the assault force to its target. In modern warfare, victory often depends not on the size of an army, but on the ability to connect information with action. Operation Neptune Spear illustrated that reality with remarkable clarity. And this is why the raid in Abbottabad quickly became one of the most studied special operations missions in modern history. It showed how years of intelligence work, careful planning, and a small team of highly trained operators could produce a result that reshaped the global war against terrorism. But the story of that night did not end with the helicopters leaving Abbottabad. Because the consequences of the operation would echo far beyond the walls of that compound. And the lessons learned from that mission would influence how wars were fought for years to come. In the early hours after the helicopters vanished into the darkness, Abbottabad slowly returned to silence. The compound that had hidden one of the most wanted men in modern history stood damaged and burning under the dim glow of emergency lights. Local residents gathered in the streets, confused by the explosions and the sudden appearance of Pakistani security forces. Soldiers moved cautiously through the area, trying to understand what had just happened inside the walls only hours earlier. But the men who had carried out the raid were already gone. High above the mountains separating Pakistan from Afghanistan, the helicopters carrying the assault force sped toward their base. Inside the aircraft, the operators sat quietly, the intensity of the mission giving way to the slow realization that the decade-long hunt was finally over. For years, Osama bin Laden had been a symbol. To some, he represented the face of global terrorism. To others, he was a ghost, an enemy who seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Entire wars had been fought in the shadow of his name. Now that shadow had ended inside a quiet compound in a military town. Yet the moment carried a strange kind of stillness. There were no cheering crowds in the helicopters that night. No celebration among the men who had completed the mission. Special operations soldiers are trained to think in terms of objectives, not symbols. The objective had been clear. Find the target. Confirm the identity. Complete the mission. And that objective had been accomplished. But even as the helicopters crossed back into Afghanistan, the world beyond them had already begun to change. Inside the White House Situation Room, officials waited for confirmation that the aircraft had safely left Pakistani airspace. Intelligence officers began preparing the announcement that would soon reach every corner of the planet. Within hours, news of the operation would spread across television networks, government briefings, and conversations in cities far removed from Abbottabad. For millions of people, the raid represented a moment of closure after nearly a decade of uncertainty. For military planners and intelligence professionals, it represented something else. Proof that modern warfare had entered a new era. An era where information could be as decisive as firepower. Where years of intelligence work could lead to a mission lasting less than an hour. And where a small group of operators moving silently through the darkness could alter the course of history. But in Abbottabad itself, the compound remained quiet. The high walls still cast long shadows across the courtyard where the helicopter had fallen. The rooms inside the building stood empty, their occupants gone. For nearly 6 years, the most hunted man on earth had lived behind those walls, hidden in plain sight. And on a single night in May 2011, the silence of that compound was finally broken. The hunt that had begun in the chaos of September 2001 had ended in the darkness of a Pakistani city. Not with an army. Not with a battle. But with a door breached in the night and a mission completed before the world even knew it had begun.